Let's take a little bit of time now to establish a bit of a historical overview. What I'm hoping to do in this video is to give you a sense of the different periods of Chinese history so you can locate what's happened before the period we're concerned about and what the key aspects of the period we want to study are. So let's make our way into a little bit of a timeline for you. Firstly, let's pick up the story at what's existing really prior to 1900, during the 1800s, certainly prior to the 1800s. And there were a whole range of dynasties at that stage that had to confront the arrival of Europeans. European empires arrive from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s onwards and carve up China into spheres of influence. China has never made a colony directly, but it's certainly exploited. So broadly speaking, we can talk about the dynasties as Americans often say, as pre-modern periods. These are the pre-modern periods in which China was formed, such as the Qin dynasty, who gave us the terracotta warriors, and Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. This is a time the Great Wall was built. The final empire or dynasty of the Chinese empire is the Qing dynasty, spelled Qing, and they were the Manchu dynasty under the Wade-Gillies or Wade-Giles system of spelling. This dynasty came down from Manchuria and conquered, and they were in place up until about 1911, when China enters a more modern phase. So we've got a period there that we don't really want to focus on. The dynasties are very long history, 3,000 years before Christ, recorded history before the Common Era. And then we've got our more European arrival a couple of hundred years ago. The modern periods of Chinese history seem to start around the middle to late 1800s, depending on which historian you're looking at. Perhaps a good starting point is what becomes known as the self-strengthening movement that takes place at this time, where the Qing dynasty start to recognize that unless China strengthens itself, they will be exploited by these industrialized nations coming out of Europe, the United States, and even Japan by the late 1800s. So during this self-strengthening movement, there are a number of rebellions. There's a number of attempts to expel Western imperialism from China. There's Opium Wars, there's the Taiping Rebellion, and later then the Boxer Rebellion, in which there are attempts by the Chinese to throw European influences out. All were ultimately unsuccessful. The Qing dynasty between 1905 thereabouts and 1911 actually attempts to modernize and reform itself, but it tends to be too little too late. And the Qing dynasty falls in 1911, and we have the creation of the Republic of China, which I've mentioned in a previous video. China becomes a republic. Sun Yat-sen becomes its first president. The Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, also known as the Kuomintang, the GMD or the KMT, and you'll often see both of those used interchangeably even in more recent books, take power in China and set about trying to modernize. But if you think about it, in this period of 1912 to 1925, we're also seeing the rise of an expansionist militarist Japan. Sun Yat-sen dies 1925 and is replaced by Chiang Kai-shek, often referred to as the Generalissimo, okay, who takes power around 1926 as a transition of power, and he is the leader, if you like, president of the Republic of China, the nationalist government, throughout World War II, the Civil War, until 1949, when the Communist Party win and the Nationalist Party retreat to their final stronghold on Taiwan, and the Chinese Republic exists to this day, while in 1949 on the mainland, the People's Republic of China is formed. So let's break that period down a little bit. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. That's the start of our unit. This war with Japan, the Second World War, if you like, in China, continues until 1945, when Japan surrenders. In Chinese history, with the surrender of Japan, we've got two rival factions trying to control Japan after the war. And this has played out in a Cold War across the world. Different countries have this rivalry between the communists, supported often by the Soviet Union, and the non-communist government supported by the United States. We'll go into this in more detail, but there's a civil war, and that's the next part you need to be aware of. A civil war in China between 1945 and 1949, between the Kuomintang, the GMD, or the Kuomintang KMT, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Now, as I've said here, you're going to see Kuomintang and Kuomintang kind of used interchangeably. It's one of those terms where the Wade-Giles, Wade-Gillies system hasn't really transitioned over evenly into the Pinyin system. So Pinyin is Kuomintang, GMD, Wade-Gillies, Wade-Giles, Kuomintang, KMT. So get used to seeing those two interchangeably. I do a little bit, a lot of the sources do it as well. So just be conscious of it. In 1949, in October, we have the declaration of the Chinese Communist Party's People's Republic of China, and it exists to this day. Mao Zedong is its important leader between 1949, with a couple of little bumps along the road, until 1976. So he becomes a big focus for this unit. He's a big focus in our assessment. We need to have our head around him. So let's break this period down again. We need to, when studying Mao, be conscious of the man and the myth. Mao is surrounded by propaganda. Mao builds a cult of personality around himself, and we've got to grapple with that concept. So his achievements versus the myth of his achievements is really important. In some respects, he's very much a notorious figure in Chinese history, but he's idealized and idolized in China to this day. So you're going to have to grapple with this concept of Mao being a monster or a hero of Chinese history. A really important concept, and the only way you can do that is looking at the different periods of his life. So in 1949, under Mao, the Communist Party take power, and they set about creating a one-party totalitarian state. During the 1950s, Mao leads what becomes known as the land reform movement. It continues after the 1950s, but from about 1950 to the late 1950s is the high point of this land reform movement, which we've got to go into. But get your head around it here. So what we're saying, if we're going to study aspects of this period, what are they? Well, there is the war with Japan we could look at, and Mao as a military leader at that time, and there's myths built around that. We could have a look at him as the leader of the CCP during the Civil War era and becoming power, and there's the idea of myth there. But then we've got his role in creating this totalitarian communist state in China, the PRC. Then we've got his land reform movement, which merges into what becomes known as the Great Leap Forward. And that Great Leap Forward involves famines and millions upon millions of deaths and so on. Great Leap Forward is abandoned in 1962. The failure of the Great Leap Forward, and I guess you can argue about that. Some Chinese say, oh, it was truly a Great Leap Forward, but I'm going to throw to you that perhaps it's not everything that the name suggests. Mao loses favour in the Communist Party for a short period there. In some respects, he moves the peripheries for a few years, but he's back in force at what becomes known as the Cultural Revolution. Now, certainly the Cultural Revolution starts in 1966. But depending on the source, it ends in 1969, it ends 1971, or it's still going when Mao dies in 1976. So I'll let you sort of get your head around this screen. It might be a good one to hit pause on and think, all right, what are the broad periods we need to be aware of here? What is the main terminology? You don't know any detail about it yet, but you're getting a picture of the journey we're on and the language we'll be using.